I would also like to just take the mic really briefly to thank everyone for coming. As Raji said, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a U.S. organization, an operating foundation that focuses on the sustainable use of outer space. We worked with ORF before on a space event back in 2011. We are absolutely delighted to be back here in New Delhi, and we thank you all for an attendance at what has already proven to be a very interesting discussion of space security. Because we are running a little tight on time and our panel stands between you guys and dinner, I'm not going to have a whole lot of remarks. I'll save them for tomorrow when I have my own presentation. You should have your bios of the speakers here in your folders. So with that, I think we're going to start immediately with our first speaker. We have Frank Rose, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State from the State Department. Frank, do you want to give your remarks? There. All right.
Great. Victoria, thanks so much for having me here tonight, and let me thank the Observer Research Foundation and my good friend Raji for inviting me. Today I want to cover three issues in my brief opening remarks. The challenge of space debris to all nations, the use of transparency and confidence building measures, or TCBMs, as a tool for addressing this and other space challenges, and the growth of the U.S.-India space relationship. As our previous speakers noted, today approximately 60 nations and government consortia operate space systems, and space has become critical to just about everything we do here on Earth. However, as the previous speakers also noted, there has been a downside, that the space system is increasingly congested, specifically with the growth of space debris. As many of you are aware, the United States Department of Defense currently tracks tens of thousands of pieces of debris 10 centimeters or larger in various Earth orbits. And we estimate there could be 500,000 or more pieces of debris smaller than 10 centimeters, but we don't currently have the capability to track that debris. This debris is a big challenge because, for example, it makes it more difficult to operate in outer space, and also we are seeing the increasing possibility of more collisions in outer space, like the 2009 Iridium Cosmos collision. So let me talk about how we address these challenges to outer space. If the urgent problem of debris is not addressed, access to some space services could someday be seriously degraded or even lost. To preserve the right of all nations to explore and use space for peaceful purposes and for the benefit of all humanity, international cooperation is necessary. As participants at today's dialogue are well aware, while most countries agree that orbital debris is a problem, there is a disagreement regarding whether it is the most important problem on which to focus. For example, some countries have expressed the view that the potential placement of weapons in outer space, as well as the threat of their use, not debris, is the most urgent problem and have prescribed a legally binding treaty as the cure. The United States and many of our allies and partners take issue with this diagnosis and the prescribed cure. After all, the debris challenge is real, affects all space actors, and is worsening. Focusing on the potential placement of weapons in outer space rather than debris is, in our view, a mistake. Furthermore, the development of terrestrial-based destructive anti-satellite weapons is far more immediate threat, as such devices exist, have been tested, and have already damaged the space environment. Yet such terrestrial-based anti-satellite weapons continue to be excluded in the updated Russian-Chinese draft treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space, or PPWT treaty. Although the draft PPWT treaty remains fundamentally flawed for this and other reasons, I would like to point out that the United States is not opposed to space arms control agreements in principle. Indeed, the 2010 U.S. National Space Policy makes clear that, quote, the United States will consider proposals and concepts for arms control measures if they are equitable, effectively verifiable, and enhance the security of the United States and its allies. We do not believe the PPWT meets any of this criteria. That said, the United States supports the pursuit of voluntary TCBMs to enhance the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment. In fact, many of these already exist and could be implemented quickly. TCBMs can address some of the most urgent challenges that all of us face, especially in the area of space debris. The creation and implementation of pragmatic, voluntary TCBMs can also encourage responsible actions in and peaceful use of space, as well as promote greater mutual understanding among space actors and reduce tensions. In some cases, we already have consensus TCBM language from the UN to build upon, as with the UN Group of Government Experts, or GGE, on outer space TCBMs, which issued a report in 2013 that was subsequently endorsed by consensus by the UN General Assembly. For this reason, we see implementation of the GGE recommendations as an important, promising, and priority area for international effort. A second promising area is the work being done in the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UN COPUOS, on the development of new international long-term sustainability, or LTS, guidelines. For over 5 decades, UN COPUOS has played a unique role in advancing the technical collaboration and cooperation on outer space while avoiding unnecessary politics. Under the capable chairmanship of Peter Martinez of South Africa, the COPUOS Working Group on Long-Term Sustainability has identified areas of consensus as well as remaining areas of disagreement. We understand that the chair's assessment is that consensus could be readily achieved on 11 of the 29 draft guidelines this year, with consensus on another 10 achievable within the next year. However, for the remaining 7 draft guidelines, all sponsored by Russia, frankly, it is going to be difficult to reach consensus. However, the bottom line is this: of these 29 draft guidelines, we believe that we can reach consensus on at least 22 within the next year. Therefore, we need to work together to bring conclusion on these consensus guidelines this year. We cannot wait. And finally, a third promising area for international cooperation is on the foundational area of space situational awareness, or SSA, which can help contribute to a more comprehensive picture of what is transparency in space and ensure the safety, sustainability, stability, and security of the space environment. We see opportunities for cooperation on SSA with other governments and non-governmental space actors around the globe, and this includes India, which I will speak more about shortly. Such cooperation on SSA is very important, as international partnerships bring resources, capabilities, and geographical advantages. To date, the United States has signed 12 SSA sharing agreements and arrangements with national governments and international intergovernmental organizations, as well as agreements with 51 commercial entities. Finally, since I'm in India, let me just say a few things about the evolving U.S.-India bilateral space security relationship. This has been a key deliverable of the 2 summits that Prime Minister Modi and President Obama have convened in the past 2 years. Indeed, in their joint statement of January 25th, 2015, Prime Minister Modi and President Obama stated, quote, to further promote cooperative and commercial relations between India and the United States, they committed themselves to work together on space cooperation. There are a number of things that we have been doing over the past couple years. Probably one of the most important things that we have been doing is the establishment of the bilateral U.S.-India Space Security Dialogue. I was in Delhi earlier today to co-chair with my colleagues from the Ministry of External Affairs the second annual dialogue, and we highlighted a number of areas where we can work together on pragmatic cooperation, both from a diplomatic point of view, but also practical areas of cooperation like space situational awareness. So I know we are short on time, so let me just stop there and turn the floor back over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Frank. Next, we'll hear from Teresa Hitchens, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland. Teresa?
Thank you, Victoria, and I want to thank ORF and the sponsors of this conference for having me here today. I have a PowerPoint. I promise I will try not to put you to sleep with it and to be very brief. I'm going to talk about multilateral approaches to space security. In my previous job as the head of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva, we worked a lot on these different aspects. And if you had asked me 2 years ago or even 3 years ago about how things were going in the multilateral domain, I would have said swimmingly. I was very optimistic a couple years ago. I'm not so optimistic now, and we'll get to the reasons why. Okay. In my assessment, the current situation is a little bit of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I think it was starting in about 2008, there began to be a focus on multilateral solutions to space security and a pretty widespread consensus that we had to work to reasons that have been mentioned already: debris, the prospect of weaponization, competition, increased players, all of those reasons. So there was a pretty widespread, if somewhat vague, consensus that something needs to be done and we need to do it together. In the time frame between 2008 and 2011, there were 5, count them, 5, actually 4, sorry, I'm missing one. There were 4 major activities that got underway at the multilateral level. You've already heard a little bit about the Russia-China draft treaty, the PPWT, whose name really needs to be condensed at some point in time, because it takes up 3 lines on my slide, which was one of the efforts, the EU proposal for an international code of conduct on space activities, the COPUOS working group, which Frank just mentioned, on long-term sustainability, and the UNGGE on transparency and confidence building measures. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because our time is limited, but you've already heard the time frame for the PPWT, and Frank has mentioned some of the issues with it. One of the things that I want to say that has not been mentioned so far is the second bullet point. It does not specifically ban development and stockpiling of weapons technologies. Okay. The interesting development that's happened recently is that Russia and the Chinese issued a response in September 2015 at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva to specifically the U.S. objections to the treaty, and I think we're waiting now for a round from Frank and company in response to the response. So that's where that current effort stands. I think Sergio Marchisio is going to address in a little more detail the EU Code of Conduct proposal, so I won't say much about this at all, except that right now it looks effectively dead, partly because of the objections from the BRICS, including India, on issues that personally, I'm sorry to say, I think were more political than substantive. We've heard a little bit about the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space effort on long-term sustainability of the space environment. This is a particularly interesting endeavor because instead of being a top-down endeavor, like a lot of the other endeavors, this is really a bottom-up. And we're looking at things from a practical standpoint and a technical nature of how can we agree on essentially best practices. This is a form of multilateral cooperation that has had a lot of success, perhaps a lot more than trying to create treaties or normative structures in the past, not just in the space arena, but in a lot of other technical areas. And this is the one place where things, as Frank just mentioned, seem to be going reasonably well. I do want to hit the 4 types of expert groups because this will give you an idea of what they're working on. Sustainable space use for development on Earth, space debris, operations and tools for SSA sharing, space weather, regulatory regimes and guidance for new actors. So all of the recommendations, the guidelines that Frank mentioned, fall somewhere under these 4 expert groups. The consultations are ongoing. We have blockages, particularly the 7 amendments that the Russians have proposed. If anyone has tried to read these, they will know why they are a blockage. But we have a little bit of more reason to be a little bit more optimistic that we might be able to make some forward motion. Frank mentioned the GGE. Again, this is a voluntary effort. The interesting part about the GGE is that it's focused on security, transparency and confidence building measures in the realm of security. It's under the first committee at the United Nations. And so this makes it somewhat different from the other efforts, which either are focused on peaceful uses or are crossover, as in the EU code. Here again, there are kind of 5 categories of recommendations that have been made. Enhancing transparency, which includes notifications regarding potential collisions, maneuvers, international cooperation, particularly on space situational awareness, consultative measures, which are kind of quite interesting, including points of contact, outreach measures, and coordination. The most recent thing to happen in this area was the October 2015 joint meeting of the first committee, which is the Security Committee, and the fourth committee, which is the Scientific Committee, covers peaceful uses of outer space. The sad part about that meeting is no one really seemed to take it seriously enough to push any progress forward. It was really just a talking effort. And I have to say that as much as I'm happy to hear Frank say that the implementation of the GGEs have priority so far, and it's now 2016, the report came out in 2013, no state has effectively moved to forward implementation progress on the recommendations of the GGE. That report has been sitting on people's desks. So that's a problem. Which is why I said that a couple years ago I was quite optimistic. You have all these new starts, all these efforts, and now I've become rather pessimistic. In effect, all these multilateral fora are stalled right now, or they're in muck, if you want to look at the LTS. It's not quite stalled, but it's kind of moving through molasses. No state has really taken the bull by the horns here and proposed a way forward, how to move these multilateral discussions actually forward. And I just mentioned that this is despite the fact that the GGE has a roadmap. One of the big problems here is Russia-Western tensions over the Ukraine and Syria. This has really been throwing a spanner in the works. It's remarkable that this is the first time, I think, since really kind of the dawn of the space age, at least, that the Russian-Western ties on the issue of space, Russian-U.S. ties on the issue of space, have really been degraded to a point that's a real low point in those bilateral discussions, and that's a problem set. And lastly, I want to mention that the U.S. is in a presidential election cycle, and while you might not think this has anything to do with space, it has everything to do with everything. And in an election year, it's very, very difficult to get progress happening, and that very, very difficult environment usually falls over to the first couple years of a new administration. So that could be a real problem. So in conclusion, since we're in India, I'm going to say if anyone in India wants to pick up this ball toward multilateral progress as a major space actor, rather than simply reacting to the situation, that would actually be welcome. And if we have time for questions at the end, I'd be happy to see if I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Next, we have Rakesh Sood, former Special Representative to the Prime Minister on Disarmament and Nonproliferation. Rakesh.
Thank you, and let me also thank ORF for organizing this. And from the number of people that I see here, it's quite clear that interest in this subject is growing. Given the fact that we are hopelessly behind schedule, I'll just limit myself to making a couple of bullet points, taking off from where Theresa ended, where she talked about at the pessimistic point, so to say. I think we need to at least be very open and frank. I mean, here we are not in the middle of a political diplomatic negotiation. And I have been in those kind of negotiations since the early 80s. I mean, I've spoken in the CD in the early 80s when the subject of prevention of an arms race in outer space had barely been introduced as an item on the agenda. I don't think there are very many who can claim to have done that. And therefore it is singularly sad that since the time that it was introduced, we've seldom been able to move forward on any substantive discussion, and this is going back more than 30 years. So therefore we have to be quite clear, and if we look back, I think there may be some interesting takeaways in terms of what happened, what drove, after all, the 1967 treaty. Okay, today we can say that there are certain lacunae in it, but then at that time, where space science and technology was, it was seen as something which was a fairly significant development. And the motivation for that came very simply because in 1957, you had a Sputnik that was sent up, and President Kennedy had announced that he had launched a man on the moon mission. The Soviets were following that. And by the way, at that time, nuclear weapon testing used to take place in outer atmosphere. So people suddenly realized that this could play havoc with any kind of space launches, and it was decided, and the first step in that direction was the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned testing outside in the atmosphere, outer space, etc., basically drove it underground. And in 1963 you had certain principles that were set out bilaterally between US and Soviet Union, which led to the Outer Space Treaty. It's as simple as that. And many of those principles reflected, as I said, the scientific and technological knowledge at that point in time. But that did not end the arms race. And the fact is, we can keep talking about the challenges that it is both civilian application and military application, but I don't think that is going to go away. And we will not be able to make a very clear distinction between this and that. And as I think somebody mentioned earlier on in the inaugural session, or perhaps in one of the speeches here, I mean, satellites can be knocked out from the Earth, or they can be tampered with from the Earth. So you don't necessarily need space-based weapons to disable space-based assets. You can disable it terrestrially. And so this kind of thing that we keep looking for definitions, I think is something that is just going to prolong discussions without any real meaningful outcomes. Now, we've seen what has happened, the initiative that the EU took in order to try and find common ground has basically come to a halt. And transparency and confidence building measures are all very well. But transparency and confidence building measures are an effective complement, but these are not a substitute, because essentially they are not backed by compliance and oversight in that kind of manner. The group of governmental experts, yes, I mean, we've just heard that not much has happened on the recommendations of the recommendations made by the UN group of governmental experts. The fact is that norm building cannot take place in a political vacuum, and I think we need to face up squarely to something like that. Now, what is happening on the side is also because, as was mentioned, I mean, today there are multiple entities, not just governments. I mean, when I talked about the Outer Space Treaty, we were talking of governments, and there too it was a bipolar world. But today, when you've got consortia, you've got startups, you've got universities, you've got scientific associations and so on, all of which are capable of launching satellites, and cost of fabricating satellites has come down, cost of launching them has come down. You can have these nano satellites or cube satellites and so on. In some ways, it leads to a proliferation of space-based assets and multiple players. So in that sense, what happens is that different entities get vested interests in terms of ensuring that if governments can't do something, then let's at least do something together so that we can develop space domain awareness. And I think we are likely to see initiatives in this direction if the governments don't get their act together. And if nothing else, I mean, they may not have the force of compliance, but they can certainly do naming and shaming for entities that do not comply, and those entities may well be governments in some point in time in future. So therefore, all I would say is that whenever there is a new human activity, we end up trying to develop laws for governing that, and that requires both policymakers, stakeholders, legal experts, and so on. Now, in an international setting, obviously, this has become more complicated, but if we continue to merely think that we can develop a new dialogue platform, that doesn't really address the underlying problem, because as military technology develops, and mind you, it is, in this particular case, it is not just military technology, it is also civilian application of space technology, which has really exploded in the last 2 decades. Therefore, development of a legal basis for restraining military behavior, I mean, I'm deliberately not using terms which, without getting into the definition of weaponization, militarization, but I think as long as we understand what we are talking about in terms of clarifying laws which restrain military behavior across the generalized notions of restrictions on use of force in this particular domain, I think we will find that this will no longer remain the common heritage of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Sergio Marchisio, full professor of international law at the University of La Sapienza, Rome.
Thank you, Victoria, and I sincerely thank the second ORF-KC annual Space Policy Dialogue for inviting me to speak in this panel. I would add some more brief notes of deception to what has been said by previous speakers concerning this issue of the state of play of governance of outer space and space sustainability with regard to non-legally binding approaches. This state of play seems to be in a very difficult phase. Disregard all contemporary efforts, current and potential frameworks, such as the adoption of the UN COPUOS Long-Term Sustainability Working Group guidelines, the implementation of the recommendations of the UNGG, and of course the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, or analogous and still to be presented initiatives. At the outset, these initiatives were seen as complementary, not competitive, but now the picture seems to be quite different from the outset. Commitment based on the principles of prevention, due diligence, and no harmful interference do not seem to be acceptable to the large majority of states. Likewise, the legally binding initiatives concerning the arms control in outer space, such as the PPWT, they face the same destiny, or at least a similar destiny. Second point, of course, we should be perseverant in spite of difficulties. We should continue to support current international efforts aimed at establishment of broad consensus on those initiatives, because their purpose is very important. It is to enhance security in outer space and encourage the responsible use of outer space. Third, concerning the different initiatives we have mentioned. First, the COPUOS work on long-term sustainability of outer space activity. It is be said that we are close to a consensus, close to a positive outcome, but late hours news from Vienna underline difficulties in reaching such consensus, even with regard to the first set of guidelines which seem to be ready for agreement. So, it is something deceiving, because this kind of work, the LTC process, is a living process, is presented as a living process, which deserves the utmost positive consideration. It is also included in this package a proposal by the United States concerning a working group on space objects and events that could help in continuing the exercise for the achieving agreement on the others points and guidelines that are at present outside the possibility of a consensus. Second, the GGE report. Yes, I agree with Teresa, fully agree that the implementation of the recommendations contained in the GGE report is very deceiving. Here too, I see a clear unresponsiveness from space actors in implementing these recommendations. Only 3 states, as to my knowledge, have submitted up to now reports to the COPUOS or other UN bodies concerning the implementation of the report at the national level. And this was one of the main points of the report, namely the implementation of the on a voluntary basis through relevant national mechanism. And of course, and you know that I have been always involved in the ICoC initiative, so I have a personal involvement, because I spent many energies and time of my life in this with this project. I should say that the picture, full of difficulties, is even stronger if we consider the project concerning the a multilateral code of conduct mentioned in paragraph 69 of the GGE report as in its incarnation in the specific proposal by the European Union. I don't know if this is due to the fact that the instrument is called Code of Conduct. Probably Code of Conduct are not the same that other kinds of soft law, but there are Code of Conducts in many, in a variety of other fields. So they have special characteristics, they are different from other categories of soft law, but nevertheless they are known to the international practice. There is an element more in the Code of Conduct, which is a political commitment to abide by some general principles. The meeting on the ICoC in July 2015 in New York, even if well attended, of course, proved once again that it is extremely difficult objective to be reached, and in the end the debate was reopened on how better to achieve the aims contained in the code. But however, let me quote Michael Crepon of the Stimson Center in the USA on that point, and I quote, he said, "TCBMs for space can help, so can guidelines for the sustainable use of outer space that may emerge from the UN's Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, but the third wave of competition in space will not crest until all major space powers are ready to endorse a code of conduct for responsible behavior in outer space. Whatever the outcome, one thing is clear. The member states of the European Union remain committed to the objectives of the code and to the key principles contained in it. I do not want to list them, but I just wanted to focus on two of them, which is, in my mind, were particularly important. The commitment to refrain from any action which brings about, directly or indirectly, damage or destruction of space objects, together with the commitment to avoid the creation of space debris, because these two commitments are strictly connected. The debris, the more anti-satellite technology is used, the more debris from destroyed satellites can be created as a result. In conclusion, international multilateral initiatives have largely failed until now to provide assurances of responsible behavior in space through diplomatic means. Nevertheless, the space security community should insist on the need to achieve tangible and pragmatic results inside the plastered existing normative frameworks. And finally, and in this regard, it is my mind that the time is ripe to call for an international conference of the state parties to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Since 1967, state parties to the OST, and they are more than 100, as we heard this evening, never met to discuss problems arising from the application of the treaty and new issues deriving from the inevitable developments that have occurred since then. And there is no other legitimate body to discuss the treaty unless the conference of the parties. We have conference the parties of everything, of every treaty. We had the COP21 in Paris for climate change, but we never had a conference of the parties of the OST. And this is the only legitimate body that can interpret the OST and can make suggestion on its regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Next, we have Cesar Jaramillo, the Executive Director of Project PowerShares.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Victoria, for sharing the session. Thank you to my fellow panelists and the excellent presentations thus far. Thank you to the audience, of course, and most importantly, thanks to ORF Foundation for inviting me to speak here today, but also for organizing this very important policy dialogue. I know time is of the essence, and I assure you dinner will come. But I will start with my conclusion, so to get that out of the way, and it's a two-part conclusion. It's related to each other. The first is that arms control as a lens, as an approach, as a policy priority is most definitely relevant, applicable, and necessary to address outer space activities. And the second related conclusion is that we should not confuse the relative merits or shortcomings, real or perceived, of instruments, of proposals such as the PPWT with the need for arms control in outer space. The PPWT may have its shortcomings or merits, but it doesn't mean that the broader question of the necessity of arms control in outer space is reduced to a single policy instrument proposal. This is not a matter of opinion. I think it's not coincidental that outer space is one of 4 core areas that are discussed at the Conference on Disarmament. It is not a coincidence that outer space is addressed at the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, which deals specifically with disarmament and international security. It is not a coincidence in the US, for example. It is dealt with at the Bureau for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. even in other arms control regimes, outer space issues tend to come up. And I'm thinking, for example, of last year's meeting of the states parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or even the first committee itself, when more than one state specifically raised the resolution of questions related to arms control in outer space and the prevention of arms race in outer space as part of the process that will facilitate progress on nuclear disarmament. So there are also linkages to other areas of arms control. Now, are outer space activities exclusively a matter for arms control? Absolutely not. But what I'm saying is that one dimension, one angle definitely calls for an arms control approach. But the challenges and dynamics of outer space activities are multifaceted, as we all know. So there cannot be an expectation for a single catch-all policy instrument to cover every dimension of outer space activities. We have commercial activities, military activities, environmental problems. Now there are reports of plans for asteroid mining, space tourism, you name it. But so these are sufficiently distinct areas that they will merit different approaches, different proposals, and different processes. And I think it's a bit of an indictment on the limits of modern diplomacy if we can only tackle one and not the others. I think there's room and capacity for simultaneity as we address the threats and the issues that are related to outer space security. It's remarkable that there is no policy instrument since the 1967 Outer Space Treaty as a point of reference for the normative regime of outer space activities. As Sergio just mentioned, it's been over 40 years since the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and although there are some proposals on the table, the international community has not been able to reach an agreement on which is the way forward, or the various ways forward to address the challenges related to outer space activities. Furthermore, I think that specifically PAROS, the prevention of an arms race in outer space, has been in recent years caught in a way in a diplomatic limbo, and it is sort of shifted from one forum to another, and it's never addressed head on. Just to give you a few examples, I mean, PAROS, it comes up every year at the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, which a PAROS resolution that specifically states that the prevention of an arms race in outer space would avert a grave danger for international security, and that the legal regime applicable to outer space does not in and of itself guarantee the prevention of an arms race in outer space. This resolution has not once been supported by the most advanced spacefaring nation in history. But it's not only at the first committee. At the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, whenever a reference to PAROS is made to the prevention of arms race in outer space, some states will take the floor almost immediately and say that that falls outside the jurisdiction of COPUOS, that COPUOS is meant to deal with exclusively peaceful aspects of outer space activities, that it should be dealt at the Conference on Disarmament. And at the Conference on Disarmament, which has been deadlocked for more than 15 years, there really is no progress. And should the Conference on Disarmament get its act together, few people think that PAROS would be the top priority, as a lot of attention in the international community will predictably be focused on FMCT, on the discussions or negotiation of a fissile material code of treaties. So PAROS, despite its undeniable importance, I would argue, has again been caught in a diplomatic limbo, and it's not exactly clear where the primary efforts to tackle it head-on are taking place. This brings me to the PPWT, and which is the long name that Teresa recently stated, but it's basically the draft treaty proposal by China and Russia on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force against outer space objects. This was introduced in 2008 and later revised a revised version was released in 2014. Now there are different views on the effectiveness of the PPWT, but I would like to address a few of the recurring criticisms or issues that are addressed with regard to the PPWT. Perhaps one of the main ones is that it contains no verification mechanisms. And people who argue this are absolutely right. It does not contain any verification mechanisms. But the other part of this is that if it did contain verification mechanisms, it would actually be a bit of an odd treaty, because normally we don't see verification mechanisms embedded in the letter of the treaty. Take the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has provisions for verification that are beyond the letter of the treaty itself, and then it delegates on the IAEA responsibility for safeguards, etc. Take the recently adopted International Arms Trade Treaty, which has been widely welcomed and joined by several members of the international community. It does not contain specific verification mechanisms embedded in the letter of the treaty as part of the treaty itself. So this expectation for the PPWT to have concrete verification mechanisms as part of the treaty itself may be based on policy, on strategic priorities, etc., but certainly not on precedent. Normally, there are no verification mechanisms in such treaties, and the PPWT draft, as you know, suggests or indicates that an additional protocol could be developed to tackle verification. The second issue that often comes up in the context of the PPWT is that it does not cover ground-based anti-satellite weapons. And this is repeated so often that it's taking a bit of a mantra demeanor. It's like, it's what you say about the PPWT. It does not include ground-based anti-satellite weapons. But I've always had a hard time understanding why this is the case. I mean, the PPWT specifically precludes any action against the physical integrity of outer space objects. It does not say that the action needs to originate in outer space. And I quote, any action against outer space objects. So I find it very hard to see how the deployment or use of an anti-satellite weapon would be compatible with that restriction, that no action should be taken against anti-satellite weapons. I mean, this is different from the discussion about the definitional ambiguity or precision of what an actual weapon in space would be, or the way it would be defined. But a separate provision of the treaty does provide for precluding or prohibiting, if it is ever adopted, any attack on an outer space object. So it follows, from my perspective, that an anti-ground-based ASAT tests or use against an adversary would be most definitely covered under the PPWT. And the third issue that I would like to say about the PPWT is that some detractors have said that because of its real or perceived shortcomings, it cannot be the basis for negotiations on an arms control agreement. I mean, and that's a fair position to have. But I wonder, I mean, what then would the purpose of the negotiation be? I mean, if you would only take a treaty that already fits all your needs and already, you know, addresses the concerns of every potential state party to that treaty, then there would be no need for negotiation. That is precisely the purpose of negotiation. So to reject it as a basis, the baseline for negotiation seems to me to expect what is not normally the purpose of having a treaty. You know, you can build on it, and if you have concerns, you raise them. So from that perspective, I think that, well, my position would not be to defend the PPWT as is. I just find it quite hard to understand why it would not be taken as a basis for negotiations. If further clarity, for example, is required as it relates to specifically singling out anti-satellite weapons, you know, step up and step forward and propose some language that would unequivocally address anti-satellite weapons if you still feel there is some ambiguity about it. But again, the offer is out there from Russia and China, and you know, that it's not a done deal, that they're open to back and forth to negotiations. In fact, so I just would take pause in terms of categorically saying that it is not a basis for negotiations, because in the course of negotiations it will predictably evolve and change. So to wrap it up, because again, I think time is of the essence. I would say that arms controlling outer space is not an illusory or misguided proposition, whatever the problems with the current proposals may be. I think it should be pursued. It is in the best interest of the international community to pursue these discussions and or negotiations, and with the understanding that it is in everybody's collective interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final speaker tonight is Abhishek Malhotra, the managing partner in TMT Law Practice.
Hi, good evening to everyone. I know that this is a space policy dialogue. We have also been made aware that the situation of state of play is grim, if not extremely serious and pessimistic. I also am extremely aware that I'm perhaps one of the least qualified amongst this august panel. And I'm terribly being made aware that I'm standing between you and dinner. But to use a quote from Douglas Adams, don't panic. There is still some hope yet left for us. I'm going to take a very brief, space of time from this gathering, only to address not so much of the international aspects as the state of play with regard to the situation in India. So we've had a great, robust space program. A lot of it, of course, is owed to the fact that we have a great organization, the ISRO, which is primarily responsible for getting us where we currently are. It has been a little over about 54 years since the initial entity was set up and renamed into ISRO in 1969. But I think where this, as things stands now, we do need this space policy dialogue to really address the current situation in India, which is increasingly clamoring for a voice from the non-state actors. And it's interesting to note that there are about 500 small or medium-sized entities which are dependent upon and generate their business from the space program in India. But other than that, we really don't have a vibrant commercial space domain. Non-state actors really are not really getting what their due worth is today. So I think the time is ripe where we look at or relook at the four policies that are currently holding sway with regard to the space domain, which is the SATCOM policy, the SATCOM norms with regard to including uplinking of broadcast signals, the remote sensing data policy of 2011, and the technology transfer policy. We have a relook at them and also address one of the most important aspects or vacuums that are currently, if I may use that word, plaguing the Indian space business sort of commercial aspect, which is the lack of a legislation. I know that efforts are on, even as we speak and debate this here, that for legislation to be drafted, and there are more than 2 or 3 different fora or entities which are actually simultaneously working on this. But till such time that sees the light of the day, we are going to be continued to have problems such as the undefined or ambiguous scope of what exactly it is that this individual commercial space actors can involve themselves in. How do they resolve issues or disputes which are not something which are remote, but which are really live and already they're faced with on a regular basis? How is it that they tackle the issue of trying to grapple with the situation of one entity being the developer of the technology, the licensor of the technology, the regulator, so as to speak, and also the decision maker in a lot of instances. So it is time where we put our heads together and come out with a comprehensive policy dialogue and hopefully meaningful suggestions by the end of this conference, which can be then contributed and put before the appropriate authorities and entities, which can then result into a possible legislation for India. And just to sort of end my brief session with another of Douglas Adams's quote from his book. If we do not achieve that relook at the policy or a legislation, then perhaps this would be apt that for a moment, nothing happened. Then after a second or so, nothing continued to happen. I hope that doesn't continue to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm looking for Raji to see if I have the all clear to have Q&A. She's right there. Hey, Raji, do we have time for Q&A?
Unless somebody has some very, very pressing questions, maybe we can
All right.
maybe we can have 2 questions and have very brief answers.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Everybody wants to.
Is everyone ready to go eat? Can I ask the panel, does anyone have any responses or anything they'd like to say, given 30 seconds or 1 minute to do so?
Yeah, I would just make one point, and that is you need to focus on the practical. If you look at space security over the last 50 years, the major advances in space security have occurred when security has intersected with protecting the space environment. For example, if you look at 1963, you had the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The Limited Test Ban Treaty is a security treaty, but it's also about protecting the space environment by not testing nuclear weapons in outer space. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union tested nuclear weapons in outer space in the early 1960s. Like my mother said about her marriage to my father, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But when we did that, we destroyed and damaged a number of our own satellites. Additionally, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is both a security treaty, no WMD in outer space, but it's also about maintaining the long-term sustainability of the space environment. Additionally, the 2007 UN Debris Mitigation Guidelines. Security issue, but also sustainability issue. So our focus in the U.S. has been focus on finding that intersection between security and the environment, and that's where you make progress. That's where we've made progress in the past. That's where we're likely to make progress in the future.